Hi everyone, so today I want to talk about The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And the thing is, I ended up giving these 2 stars, but I feel like, looking back, I feel like maybe I was a little harsh, and some of the reasons why I don't like this book, I didn't end up liking it that much or ended up disappointed with it, are partly because I started reading the book and I thought it was supposed to be literary fiction. When I started reading it, I figured that it wasn't. I started to figure that it was more of a horror thing, and I also checked out the listing on Goodreads, and that's what told me for sure that it was supposed to be horror. And so I figured out, well, I should judge it differently now. But I was still sort of. But I feel like even after knowing that it was horror, there's a couple of things about it that disappointed me a little bit. And the thing is, I don't read that much horror, and I do sometimes. I sometimes watch horror movies. I do like to watch them once in a while. I don't read that much horror. I feel like sometimes horror stories and movies tend to make me either angry or sad rather than scared. And I wasn't expecting to be scared necessarily from this book, and I really wasn't, but I don't really hold it against it because generally what I judge in reading, regardless of the genre, is whether I think the storytelling is good or not. So that's what I'm basing my review on. My main problem, I'm going to go through, writing style and all these things and pacing and all these things, but first of all, I want to mention this video is going to have a bunch of spoilers, so if you haven't read the book and you are planning to read it, you should probably not watch this video. So my main problem, which is probably my most subjective problem, but I do personally think it's also a problem of storytelling when this happens. I guess my most personal or subjective issue with this book is the fact that it uses these two specific tropes that I really like in horror and generally in any fiction. Which are the ones having the pets die first and then the women die first, the girlfriends of the main characters, or just overall the women who are close to the main characters. More specifically, I am referring to a trope that generally tends to be called woman in fridge trope. That's what I'm referring to. Or who are known by them or appreciated by them, those die first, and then it's the men. And what bothers me is rather the fact that the women get the most horrible and gory deaths that are detailed in this really gross way, which I don't mind by itself. I don't mind gore, especially in a movie, in a book that I know is horror. And even if it wasn't horror, I wouldn't mind that there's gore in it. I mean, I think it also shows off some of his writing skills in terms of description, the way that he writes the gore. But it does bother me that it seems that the women, the female characters, are the characters who get the most gory deaths, really explicitly described and all these things, and then the men just die by being shot or just kind of disappear somewhere to die, or just die off screen, if you will. Like Victor died, he basically died off screen, and the deaths of the women and of the pets are used just to punish the main characters or just to advance their plots and their arcs as characters. And so the women are basically just pawns in the story. Again, I don't mind gore in writing itself, and it shows off a lot of the author's skills, but that's not what my issue is. My issue is not the gore itself, but it does bother me a lot. It's one of the first things that started to really bother me in the story. And the first time I read it, when I read him killing Shaney, it was really horrible, but at the same time I'm like, okay, so that's what's gonna happen in the story then. And I felt like the story was sort of shifting to make him a villain and to make Louise the villain. And then when she dies, when his wife dies, I'm like, I also felt that it was part of his arc, I felt like it was part of the story, trying to, twist it a little bit on you and make him the villain. But then the way that things turned out after that, when Jolene died, I was like, you know what, there is a pattern. There is a pattern here of the female characters being treated in a completely different way, and their deaths being portrayed in a very different way than that of the men. And that's when it started to land on me, and I started to really dislike the book. So I'm gonna go now with my usual points that I go through. The first one being writing style, which I give half a star. I think that it's a really vivid style. Like I said, there was a lot of really good writing in terms of description, especially in terms of description. It uses a lot of really effective metaphors that I thought were really clever and really funny sometimes. But it's sometimes, I think, especially in the action scenes, the description, or rather the narration, is really hazy and complicated, and it kind of loses some of the momentum of the action because you kind of have to read it. You have to read through it twice in order to understand what exactly is even going on. And I don't mind having to read something twice, but when it comes to action, it sort of loses. Again, it loses that momentum. It doesn't really have the same punch as if you had to read something once and immediately understand what's going on. So in terms of the storyline or the pacing, I gave it no star. The pacing is really difficult, to say the least. The most intense and the gory parts of the story, which are really, really short and more sudden, are preceded and they're followed by kind of mundane things that last forever and they kind of drag on. It also does this pet peeve of mine where the first character to be introduced is not actually a main character and he's killed off in the first chapter, in the same chapter where he's introduced. And I'm guessing the author did that for the sake of having action from the beginning of the story instead of having to wait until like a fourth of the way into it. A quarter of the way into it, I mean. And again, going back to the whole gory deaths of the women thing, the arc of Louis, his story arc felt kind of unearned. The way that he died and everything, in the sense that I think near the end he made these decisions that he didn't really get any comeuppance for. He didn't really get any real punishment for. I expect some over punishment, I guess, to happen in a horror story, but not under punishment. And whether Shani was actually the elk-head woman or not, he admits after killing her that he didn't really know for sure whether it was her or not, after he had killed her in a horrible way. So he intentionally kills a woman in a horrible way, and then he lets his wife die in an accident that he could have helped her or prevented, or at least he could have gone to her and be like, okay, bye Pira, I love you, bye, something. Bye. I don't know, he could have done something of the sort. It just seemed really strange and psychopathic of him to be going through, obviously he was going through some shit. And again, I felt like that first third of the story, or quarter, I guess, I don't remember, but the first third or so of the story, it felt like it was going through that sort of story of him becoming, going insane. I felt like it was about that. Like it was potentially about him going insane, and sort of becoming the kind of person that will kill someone just out of paranoia, I thought that was the direction that the story was going for, and it could have still been horror, psychological horror. But then things went away but I'm gonna go through it later. But I want to mention the fact that it seemed that, he did all these things that I found it, as a reader, I found it hard to forgive him for, because again, I felt like the story was kind of going to the point of making him the villain, and then he just dies by being shot. That's the end of his story arc. He just dies by being shot. After doing all of that, he just gets shot. And that's his punishment, basically. And that's the kind of comeuppance or punishment that he was going to get anyway, that we expected for him to get anyway, because we knew that there was something behind him, or that, he was kind of, even if there wasn't anything behind him, his own mind would have been playing something on him that basically doomed him from the beginning of the story. So it was really odd to me that he didn't really get any specific comeuppance or consequences for killing someone that way and for doing that to his wife. It just seemed really unsatisfactory to me as a reader. And I also think that the story kind of downplays his active role in his decisions. I think it felt to me like it made him seem as if he was more of a passive character, and that he was just being controlled, or that his destiny was completely just made by the elk-head woman, rather than him also making decisions that affected his story. So I already kind of mentioned this, but I think the story started off in a tone that to me seemed more like literary fiction. Or maybe it was me interpreting it as him going insane and all these things, but rather than the elk-head woman being necessarily real, or I felt that there was a possibility of that as well, but I wasn't sure, and I felt like there was going to be some more exploration of him psychologically, of Louis psychologically, and of the other guys. And then the story just kind of devolves into a slasher movie, basically, but in text form. And I felt like there was gonna be some more discussion, or some more of a focus on this idea of like trauma and guilt. Throughout the story, I started to feel like certain things could happen that would make the story a bit more interesting or more experimental. And maybe some things were going to be twisted or what have you, but then that didn't really happen at all. The spirit just kind of did the obvious things, kill their loved ones first, then kills the guy themselves, for revenge, and the formula is just there for you. And the worst part of the novel is probably the part where at some point one of the guys, Cassidy, I think, kills Gabe's. No, it's Gabe who kills Cassidy's girlfriend, and then accidentally, and then right after that, it's Cassidy who kills Gabe's. He kills Gabe's, daughter supposedly, but that's not really what happens if you read it. But and then after that, they start to have, and all of that is just for them to have some drama and some conflict between each other. Then they just have starting this drama between each other of like, oh, you killed my girlfriend, no, you killed my daughter. I mean, that is the most cringeworthy part of the entire novel, especially because we've had really very little development of their characters until before that point. In my opinion, anyway, I feel like they almost seem sort of like interchangeable characters at that point. We hadn't seen enough of them, or we hadn't understood them as different characters, and we hadn't seen them have real conflict between each other until that point. So it didn't really even feel like that, like I was that invested in their story, because again, it was the first time they ever had a conflict in the story, from what I remember anyway. Now I have to say, I do really like the ending. I like the fact that it sort of adds more depth to the main message or the main theme of the story. And it's very surprisingly ungruesome in comparison to the rest of the story, and it gives you this sort of hopeful but still realistic ending that I do like, but I don't like it enough that it can really make up for the rest of my issues with the storyline and the storytelling and the writing and all these things in the pacing. So in terms of the characters, I give it half a star. I think some of the characters are awarded more depth than others, and they're given more of a real personality. Louis is very disappointing, I guess. He was very interesting as a character, and then it just kind of stops and nosedives, and I don't know, I think it's very weird. The decision to have him die, especially off screen, is very weird to me, because he had been developed as a character for a while, and then it just stops. It just stops like that. And most of the characters do have some degree of development or backstory, but it only gets brought up almost as soon as they're about to die, or it only gets brought up basically so that you have some degree of understanding of who they are before they die. Obviously, an exception being the Nora. I think she's basically the only exception. The first third of the novel, I think it handles development a little bit better. Like, you do have a pretty good understanding, at least of Louis and Peta. I mean, some of the other characters, I feel like the unearthing of their personalities was kind of rushed in order to really focus on the action. That's one of the main problems, I guess, with the story, that it seems to want to focus more on the action instead of on the characters, or in a way that really makes justice into the story. Now, for depth, I gave it half a star. I was kind of thrown off by the use of the second person narration whenever talking about the elk-head woman, but then it started to seem more deliberate, because it's like the author wanted you to some degree to sympathize with her in comparison to the guys, the rest of the guys that weren't after Louis, Cassidy and Gabe. But then, that section of the story also felt a little bit boring, because you knew that you kind of just wanted her to go and kill them, especially because at that point I kind of knew that she was going to try and kill other people first in order to punish them. So I just wanted her to go and kill them instead of having to kill all these people around them, and all the dogs and the girlfriend. I mean, I know that I'm getting mad at that, but I keep going back to that, I know, but it bothers me, And then when the victim became the Nora, or the next potential victim became the Nora, we started to see the writing again from her perspective, from the Nora's perspective. It wasn't third person, but it was written in a way that, you were reading from her perspective, from what she was seeing and feeling. So that was a really good choice as well in terms of writing. But I do wonder, who was the narrator supposed to be within in the second person narration, like who was that person supposed to be, who was the person who was supposed to be talking to the elk-haired woman. I feel like that wasn't even really explored or anything. Now I think that there's many themes that the book is handling, but I think that it also sometimes, I think the structure and the pacing and all these things make it difficult for them to all develop throughout the story. And the main theme, I think the main theme of this idea of deviating from tradition or disrespecting tradition did kind of seem fully developed, and it did reach its logical conclusion in a satisfying way, I would say. But I also felt that there were some things that were unexplored. Like I said, this potential theme that I think was kind of like brushed over, this idea of the trauma and the guilt of the characters, was kind of explored with Louis, but then with the other characters, with Cassidy and Gabe, it was kind of just, it wasn't really there. And there were some other things that were mentioned in a couple of lines of dialogue, but they weren't really explored either. Like this idea of either going outside of the reservation or getting back inside and dying in the process. It was pointed out by one of the characters, but there wasn't really anything in the story that it was really connecting with. And there wasn't really that much of a discussion of that either, because you could tell that there was some issues in terms of the identity of these characters, partly because they said it and partly because of things relating to the story. Victor's son, I don't remember his name, the one they were making the sweat lodge for, and also they were doing it for Louis, but that whole thing, you could tell that there was some degree of sort of interest in reconnecting with these aspects of their identity, and there was a lot of importance placed on that. But I feel like there wasn't much exploration of that beyond a couple of, again, some lines of dialogue, they did kind of connect with that, but I feel like that wasn't really connecting with the main story, and they basically seemed like two different themes that weren't really connecting with each other. But I do see that there is a relationship between both of those things. The fact that when they were younger, the fact that they went to that place where they shouldn't have been hunting and they knew they shouldn't have been there, it was obviously them placing not a lot of value on tradition and on their own cultures. And then, that's kind of why they ended up facing the consequences of that. And I think that theme kind of was continued with the whole sweat lodge thing, but I think it was continued a little bit, but it wasn't quite explored. You didn't really get to see that well how much they had changed from the time 10 years ago that they had hunted those elks. I would have also been more interested in both of them as characters and seeing them differently, being more able to see them as two completely different characters if there had been some more conflict between them before that maybe was about tradition and was about their culture, and how maybe one of them feels like they are more traditional or more Indian than the other, and all these things, and it turns into like a real conflict between them, or it turns into like some tension between them, or something of sort, not just like surface level jokes or something like that, but something that genuinely causes them some distress or pain, or it forces them to really have tension between each other. And again, that sort of psychological side of the characters was explored much more with Louis than it was explored with Cassidy or Gabe, or with Rick, who I understand why maybe he wasn't developed as much, because he obviously died in the beginning of the story. But I don't know, I feel like there was a bit of a missed opportunity with character development in terms of that. And again, even in the case of Louis, even though I do appreciate his character development and the way that he was written as a character, the way that his arc ended also feels a little bit like it kind of just interrupted everything, and it didn't really continue with the rest of the story. There's a real sort of cut between that first third of the story and the rest of the novel. They're completely different in tone and everything. I don't mind a genre shift. I think it can be done well, but I think there was also a shift in terms of depth, in terms of character development. Like, it just kind of stopped after the first third. But yeah, I feel that the last 2/3 or so of the story were not quite doing what I felt the first third was promising. Now, in terms of enjoyment, which I gave half a star to, Like I said, I was a bit bored throughout some of the moments, especially when the narrator was kind of giving you, feeding you some backstory of the characters, or looking back at sort of mundane moments in order to reference them later. Also, in terms of my enjoyment, I felt that, I don't know, I thought the story was actually very funny at some points, not just in dialogue, but also, well, mainly in dialogue. One of the last lines that I thought was kind of funny was when the Nora just said, when she was kind of in this, she was playing basketball with Shani, or the elk woman, as Shani, and she's like, "But they don't teach you this at L school," and very strange line, but I thought it was kind of funny. It really made me smile when I read it, which I think also helped ease the tension of that moment. So it was funny. I mean, some other parts of the story were kind of funny, and I liked reading it at some points. I really enjoyed some aspects of the story, but as a whole, I think it has problems that I just can't really forgive enough to give it 3 stars. Yeah, those were my issues with The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Tell me what you think about it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.